Welcome to Baden Hill. It's very convenient that we're on Baden Hill because we're going to talk about geography. We're going to talk about Russian geography. And it comes within this second installment of our unit where we're going to talk about the Reds rising. Now, I just want to remind you again of why we call this unit Reds. Reds are a nickname for people who embrace communism. And honestly, Reds is seen as a good name for people within that group. It can be viewed as a negative name. And I want to caution you, you don't ever label someone and try to make sure that they are comfortable with that name if you are calling them by that name. But Reds here refers to anyone who is communist. Within Russian society, Reds were seen as the defenders of the common people. And so they were almost heroes. And in Chinese communist society, red gets an additional meaning because red is such a positive color within Chinese culture. So generally speaking, if you see red on a flag, there's a chance that that country may have been influenced by communism, by Marxism, by Leninism, or by some other ism connected to communism or socialism. So let's get into some geography. You know that Russia is huge, and you should know that it comprises most of the Asian continent. It is 1/6 of the Earth's land mass. Mind-blowing. It is approximately 6,000 miles from St. Petersburg, which is also known as Petrograd, from that city to Vladivostok in the east. So you've got 6,000 miles if you measure from that those 2 points. And in addition, you have 11 different time zones. So the United States has 5 time zones, although you have the territories that go beyond that. But basically, we have 4 main time zones on our continent, and then we have Hawaii as well. So a way to think of it is the United States is half the size of Russia with twice the population of Russia. So Russia is not only a huge landmass, it's also fairly sparsely populated. And they actually have a problem because their economy depends on labor and they can't get enough workers. Major cities you have been able to study: Moscow, the capital, St. Petersburg or Petrograd, which was the former capital established by Peter the Great, Tsar Peter the Great, who saw St. Petersburg as a window on Europe. And that was a very important city for him in the West, facing the West, because he wanted to be more like Europe. And you also have Vladivostok, which is in the far east and is a seaport. And so you have fishing and shipbuilding as industries. And, those are the primary cities, and you'll be able to read a little bit more about various cities. The economy is primarily based on the mineral and just the natural resources that are in the ground. And because of the climate in Russia, the ground is frozen for much of the year. And so technologies have had to be developed to break through the permafrost. And you could have a mile deep of frozen earth, and you had to be able to drill down to get to oil and natural gas. And those have been tapped now. And so Russia's economy is growing and depends on oil prices largely. So you have obviously the northern European plain, which continues into Russia. And if you are in a place like Ukraine, it is good farmland. And so a majority of the population in Russia lives in the eastern portion of the country. And then you have the Wild West, essentially. Excuse me. Okay, I got those flipped. The western part of the country is where the population is, so the reverse of China, basically. And in the east, you have the wild east, and that would be Siberia. And you have tundra, the frozen tundra of Siberia. So the climate generally in Russia does not provide for a long growing season, and so agriculture is not their mainstay. They have to import a lot of their grain. The economy then is based on the mineral wealth that it has, and it has some of the most amazing mineral deposits in the world. Think of the Canadian Shield area and how many minerals were there. You'll understand Russia as well. Just some features that you should know: the Ural Mountains are generally seen as the dividing point between Russia and, I should say, the dividing point between Europe and Asia. And so it's within Russia, and part of Russia is in Europe, and most of Russia is in Asia. So that's very important. You also have the Caucasus Mountains. We've talked about them before. The former Soviet republics of Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia. Those are the Caucasus republics. And you have, the Black Sea, where honestly, Europeans have been able to go into the Black Sea and have been able to dominate that region. But recently, Russia has tried to exert its influence in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea as well, the northern part of Europe. You have the Baltic republics that are independent now, but in years past, in centuries past, they were dominated by Russia, which was their neighbor. So, what do Russians live for? How do they live? Well, obviously bread is scarce, and so bread is extremely important to them. In addition, they have a desire to own their own land and to be able to grow things on their own land. And so this has been something that they haven't had throughout most of their history, that the common people were serfs and they worked on someone else's land. And so the vision of having their own land was something that drove them forward. And so bread, land, and peace, you will hear me say that again, it became their slogan during World War I and then into the Russian Revolution, which was the result of not having bread, not getting land that they may have been promised, and finally not having peace and having to fight a war that was killing them when they were completely unprepared. What about invading armies? Is it easy for them to conquer Russia, since Russia seems to have a lack of certain resources? They have mineral wealth, but it's frozen in the ground. Russia has human resources and human strength. And throughout history, invading Russia means not just going against the Russian people, but going against Russian geography. Russian geography is massive, and so controlling Russia is just a daunting idea. It also means it's difficult for the Russians to get their goods from place to place. The building of the Trans-Siberian Railroad was a huge victory for the economy in Russia. You also have the Volga River, which is the lifeblood of Russia, and the Don River, which connects to the Volga River and flows into the Sea of Azov. The Aral Sea is something that you should know. It's not in Russia anymore. It's not in, it was in the Soviet Union, but it's not in Russia. But it is very important, and it shows what happened because of poor land usage. The waters of the Aral Sea were drained off to irrigate cotton plantations, cotton farms, and as a result, the Aral Sea lost most of its water and has become very toxic. But invading Russia, is that an easy task? No. Napoleon discovered it, and so did Hitler. It is impossible to really take advantage of Russia. At the dawn of the Russian Revolution, Russia had been sleeping for centuries. In many ways, Russia had remained the same since the Middle Ages, since the time when the Mongols were dominating Asia, and that would have been the time of a civilization known as the Grand Duchy of Moscow, or the Rus. The Rus became the people of Russia, so those two words are connected. But just know back then, in the Middle Ages, in the 1400s, Russia was not the size that it is today, and it was centered around the city of Moscow, and it was governed by a group of princes. And below the princes were people called boyars, and these boyars were like nobles. And so what you see is that there was a hierarchy. You had princes, boyars, and eventually you'd get down to the bottom and you had most of the people who were serfs. We call this kind of a system feudalism. It's very similar to what we had in Western Europe, where you had lords of a manor, and you had serfs, and you had vassals who were maybe knights who served the lord in battle and received some property in return. So this feudal system, for 500 years, it dominated Russia, and life did not progress as quickly in Russia as it did in Europe. Things did not change as quickly. And that's especially true with the Industrial Revolution in England and Scotland and even in France and Germany. The Industrial Revolution from 1750 forward, it changed everything very rapidly. Germany was a little slower because it wasn't a country until later in the 1800s, but Germany caught up and built railroads like crazy. In Russia, at that same time, railroads were seen as kind of a novelty, and the only railroad went right to the leader's palace, and the leader was named the Tsar. Now, the word Tsar comes from Caesar. It's connected to Roman history, and the idea for those Russian princes is they wanted to have a connection not just with Rome and the Caesar, but also with Constantinople, which was considered to be the second Rome. And the feeling was that the Russian civilization could become the third Rome and could carry on the tradition of the Caesars. The connection with Constantinople, which was an Eastern Orthodox capital, was very important because Russia then became Eastern Orthodox in its Christianity and had the same structures and belief system. So you can see that hierarchy is very important, that nobles are far above serfs, and they're not likely to give up their power anytime soon. It took until 1861, which, interestingly enough, is the beginning of the U.S. Civil War. It took until 1861 for the serfs to get their freedom. And even though they were emancipated, they were freed, they still worked just like they were slaves. So it really didn't change anything. And 50 years later, the serfs and the peasants were still struggling. Russia did start to develop cities and industries in the cities. And many people who couldn't survive in the countryside anymore, they did move to the cities, but not nearly like what happened in the rest of Europe or even in the United States. So what happened was there were a few educated people. There were some doctors and lawyers and some middle-class bourgeoisie people who were an intelligentsia. They were the elite people who knew that it was wrong for the Tsar to do what he was doing, and yet they wanted power for themselves, essentially. At least they wanted more power for themselves. And yes, they wanted the idea that you would have more freedom and better working conditions and things like that for the rest of the people. And so they felt that they were the spokespeople for everyone. But there were also people who were radical and wanted to blow everything up, sometimes very literally, like the anarchists. So I say these things because it's all important leading up to what came next. There were rivalries among the reformers. As I said, some were very radical and some believed in capitalism and just believed that you should have more socialism and more programs to help poor people and help people have health care and things like that. So industrialization was another factor in society that was changing Russia dramatically. And Russia was slow to change, but the industrialization did have an impact, and workers were experiencing some of the same things that were happening in Western Europe and the United States. They were being paid dirt, poor wages, and were not able to rise in society. Finally, another factor that is leading toward revolution is the fact that there were so many cultures and languages in Russian society. It was a multi-ethnic society because the Russian Empire had swallowed up all these little countries with their own languages, and those people did not want to be Russified. They didn't want to be made Russian, and they, in the back of their minds, they were always thinking, when we get a chance, we will have a revolution. Russia is mainly known for one dynasty, the Romanov dynasty. Michael Romanov in 1613 ascended to power and became the ruler of what would become the Russian Empire. And so the Romanov dynasty lasted 300 years. During that time, they didn't change very much. What's really interesting is that most people today, if they know anything about Russia and the Romanov dynasty, they might know about Anastasia. Anastasia was the youngest daughter of Nicholas II, and Anastasia disappeared during the revolution. The family, the Romanov family, was assassinated, was executed just after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution in October, November of 1917. In 1918, on July 16th, the family they were in a secret place. They were taken together to a basement and told that they were going to be protected, but then gunmen came in and killed them all. Their remains were actually found in 1991. After the end of the Soviet Union, their remains were dug up, and during that time there had been many people who had claimed to be Anastasia, and some were very convincing and seemed to have even connections to the royal family that had been executed. But it turned out in 1994 they did genetic testing, and the main candidate wasn't Anastasia, wasn't related to the Romanov family. But who knows? Anastasia might still be out there. She'd be pretty old by now, one of the oldest people in the world, so it's not likely. But that is the story of Anastasia, and it's very interesting. Finally, I want to say that royalty, including the czars, it's a fascinating reality that the royalty all over Europe, including Russia, were related during the time of the Russian Revolution. Nicholas II was first cousins with George V, who was the ruler of the UK. Nicholas II was first cousins with the rulers of Denmark and Norway. In fact, and it gets kind of weird, he was first cousins with King George V and King George's wife. So both of them were first cousins with Nicholas II. And that means you've got cousins marrying cousins. And that is a reality of royalty. All the way back to the Egyptians. And at that time, they even had brothers and sisters marrying each other to keep things in the family, to keep power in the family. So the killer is that Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was also first cousins with Nicholas II and with George V. So the rulers of the countries that fought World War I were first cousins. Go figure. You need to know that there were several czars that we should reference. And the first one is Nicholas I. Nicholas I actually visited Robert Owen in Scotland and his community there, which was an industrial community using socialism to guide its development and its communal life. And Nicholas was fairly impressed and actually wanted Robert Owen to send 2 million people to Russia to build these communities, these industrial communities. But of course, Robert Owen said, no, I can't really do that. And that's about all that came of it. Nicholas I was quite conservative, and he was responding to a lot of the revolutionary activities in Europe at that time, and he wasn't ready to have a big revolution. After him came Alexander II. Alexander II was a reformer, but ironically, he was killed, assassinated by an anarchist. At the same time, in the United States, there was an assassination of President Garfield. And President Garfield was assassinated by someone who was connected to his campaign. But there were all these tensions, underlying tensions, that this is possible now for political figures and leaders, that you can kill someone with a bomb or a handgun or whatever you might be able to come up with. Alexander III was the next Tsar, and there was a plot to assassinate him, led by the older brother of Vladimir Lenin. That is what many people think led Lenin to become revolutionary, because he saw his older brother do this, and his older brother was executed for his role in this plot to assassinate the Tsar Alexander III. After Tsar Alexander III came Nicholas II. He inherited his kingdom, his empire, just before the year 1895. 1895 was a year when, again, there was revolutionary activity, and Lenin was sent into exile to Siberia because of his participation in that. So right away, Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, he's faced with this revolutionary activity. He didn't really want to be Tsar, but he was going to put down his foot. He got rid of the revolutionaries, sent them to Siberia, and that should have been the end of it in his mind. I want to talk now about the Russian Orthodox Church. You just saw the image of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. It's actually Vasily the Good, or Vasily the Great, who was a saint, and it's his cathedral. St. Basil's Cathedral is how it's known to the rest of the world. And it's famous because of its onion-shaped domes and the multicolor outward appearance. It's kind of like a fairyland structure. It was a cathedral. During the time of the Russian Revolution and beyond, in the 1920s, it became a museum because the Russian communists were atheists. And that was one of the main ideas of Karl Marx, is that religion keeps people down. It's not real. It's made up by the church just so they can keep power. And so St. Basil's Cathedral became a museum. But during the time of the Russian Revolution, it was still cathedral. It's actually 9 different churches grouped together, and that was a symbol of the power of the Russian Orthodox Church. Tsar Nicholas actually he involved a member of that church, a monk named Rasputin, by inviting him to come and be a healer of his own son, Alexei. Alexei, Nicholas's son, had hemophilia. Hemophilia means your blood doesn't clot properly, and so you can die when you get cut or when there's bleeding. And so Rasputin, this monk, was a weird guy, and he wasn't an official priest, but he came into the palace, into the Kremlin, which is the area, the castle area of Moscow, and he apparently people said he was able to do faith healing, and he could heal Alexei, or at least stop the bleeding. Well, he gained more and more influence, and he became a very strange part of this story. The everyday Russian people believed he was a spy, and that he was watching them, and would basically it made the people distrust the church and distrust the royal family as a whole. Even the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, who were called the Holy Synod, it's kind of like the College of Cardinals in Roman Catholicism. It's a group that comes together, all the church leaders or bishops, and it's called the Holy Synod. In the Lutheran Church, we have the Synod, which is our headquarters, and so we have that same name. It means a coming together, and it goes all the way back to the earliest Christians meeting for a council in Jerusalem. Well, they didn't approve of his lifestyle. He was known to be corrupt, taking bribes, and just doing a lot of immoral acts. And so even though he was supposed to be healing Alexei, the prince, they knew about his corruption. And so this just led to the idea that the Russian Empire is this apple, and it's rotten at its core. Now we're going back to the man I mentioned earlier, the radical whose brother tried to assassinate the Tsar, Vladimir Lenin. Now Lenin is a fascinating person as well. The story of the Russian Revolution is just filled with colorful characters, and it's almost like this drama, this play written by Shakespeare or somebody. Nicholas II, Anastasia, Rasputin, and you have Lenin, who is this radical, and he is, again, he's a thorn in the flesh for Nicholas II from the very beginning of his reign. We're going to use a kind of a gimmick here, and I'm going to tell you 5 things that all start with R, because this is about Russia and the Reds, and so we're going to do 5 R's here. Lenin was a reformer. He did desire to make things better, and Marxism appealed to him. It's likely that as a student, he experienced being expelled because of his views, but he learned a lot about the radical ideas that were floating around Europe and the whole world. And so he wanted to reform society so that people who needed things in life were given those things, and the wealth of society could be given to people according to their needs. So if you don't need much, you don't get much. Gradually he became more and more radical, and he was one who he refused capitalism altogether. He also had this idea that you needed to have a small group called the vanguard who would lead the revolution. And he believed that there would be 2 revolutions, one basically to get rid of the leaders on top, and that would be, those intelligentsia would cause that revolution. And then there would be a workers' revolution that would overthrow them. And he was right. He was prophetic in a sense. he had these strong ideas, and it's very apparent that he didn't have much patience for people who disagreed with him. He was famous for getting people riled up. So we could say he was a populist. He was somebody who appealed to the everyday people. He knew what they wanted, and he told them that he could get it for them. He made promises pretty easily and didn't always keep those promises. Well, eventually he was rejected by being sent into exile, first in Siberia. He came back in 1900 from Siberia, but then went to Western Europe. That's where he took on the name Lenin. And in 1905, you know that there was Bloody Sunday and the Revolution of 1905, which was mainly just workers' strikes. But Lenin came back to Russia at that point, and he was a part of the reforms that were starting to happen. But the Tsar only made reforms for a little while, and then in 1907, he started kicking people out of the country again. And so Lenin was sent into exile once more to Switzerland. And we'll talk about what happened next in another video, but he was clearly a Red. He was clearly through and through one of these communist believers. He was a Bolshevik, and that was the name he clung to proudly. That means majority, and his feeling most likely was that the majority will win, even if it seems like they're falling behind or underfoot. They will rise up and overcome those above them.